Given the predominance of superhero characters in cinema over recent years, I think it's fair to say that comic book characters are more popular now than they've almost ever been. They're much more recognisable, they're much more ubiquitous throughout society. However, less people are reading Marvel and DC comics than ever before. Publishing numbers have plummeted over the last few years. And I've spoken to a lot of people and asked them, do you read comic books? And some people, of course, the answer will be no straight away, they have no interest. Other people have interest, but there's a couple of reasons that put them off. Now, if the first reason is cost or time, I get it. It's an expensive and a time-consuming hobby. But if the third reason is that you don't know where to start, and that you're concerned, particularly for long-running characters, you're concerned that you have missed out, that you don't understand the background, then I also get that. But it's less of a concern, because really it's up to the publishers to try and balance this act between accessibility to bring in new readers and respecting the continuity. Well, not necessarily respecting the continuity, but respecting the feeling and the sensation and the purpose of what's come before. And one of these big issues, and one of the biggest ways where comic book publishers have multiple times sort of repeated or undone or confused the matter, is when they kill off a character only to bring them back. It's a trope beyond, instantly recognisable. You almost don't trust the storyline. It's sort of, when you're reading one of these stories and you see someone die in a long-running franchise, not just comic books, this affects TV, it affects movies, it affects all literature. You see someone die and it should be a shocking moment. But if there's a little voice in the back of your head going, nah, they'll just bring them back in 2 years' time, that undermines it completely. So given that there's such a trope about comic book characters absolutely failing to stay dead, I thought it'd be worth pulling actually the publishing history of two of the big Western comic corporations, looking at the characters that have been around for many, many years and saying, how often, how much are they killing people? And can you really trust death in comic books? So first, let's set ourselves a criteria. I'm not going to record every time any character has died in comic books, because that would be absolutely silly. What I'm looking for here are points where at the end of an issue, the character appeared to be dead and it wasn't immediately followed up. Largely, I'll say it wasn't immediately followed up the next issue with a revelation that they hadn't died. I will pull out one of two of these because, one, I think they're significant. Character deaths which were designed by the publisher to write the character out of the story. Character deaths that were preordained by either Marvel or DC editorial to be a point where they no longer wanted that character to be around, either permanently or temporarily. Anything that is a clear, precise moment where you can say that character's journey is done, they're dead, they are no more. And then at some point later, someone, either the same creator or a different creative team, came in and said, no, I think there's more we can do with this character and I want them back. And we won't do it for every comic book character. Let's just look at a few notable examples from Marvel and DC comics. So, we are following phase 3 of the MCU, and Iron Man has been established as the most popular comic book superhero of that era. He really wasn't before the MCU arrived, trust me. We'll look at the timeline from around the 1960s, because that's when a lot of things were created that sort of set the scene and the characters for the comic book industry as we'd recognise it today. Iron Man has been around since the early 1960s, and the first real event death that we had, where he was written out of the comics, was in the early 1990s. The character was suffering from a severe illness with which there was no cure, and he elected to have himself put into cryo storage rather than actually face the ignominy of death. But he was actually written out of the comics for 1.25 years until magically the cure was found and he came back. But he then only lasted a few more years before he was killed. There was a big event comic where actually Iron Man turned evil. Define evil. But he was turned on, and so they brought a replacement younger version of Iron Man in from an alternative universe, and this younger Iron Man killed the Tony Stark as we knew and recognised him, and took his place. So for several years, 4.5 years, Tony Stark that we had known and loved was dead. And the Iron Man comics featured this young teenage Tony, who wasn't our Tony, was Tony from another universe, and that lasted for 4.5 years. It's not Iron Man being written out of the comics, but it's the old Iron Man. It's Tony Stark as we knew him being written out, and almost an imposter starring in the comics in his place. After 4.5 years, they resurrected and merged the original Iron Man with this replacement, and then he had several more years into the millennium where he was the star of the Iron Man comics. There was another half-year period where he was killed. Essentially, he was brain dead, and then someone decided that they could reset his mind and bring him back, resurrect him, but with no memory of recent events. He lasted a few more years. There was a temporary death for both Iron Man and Captain America just before the Secret Wars event in 2015. They were both killed in the last issue of Jonathan Hickman's Avengers run, and then resurrected at the end of Secret Wars with the resetting of the Marvel Universe. So that's a tiny insignificant death. That was undone, but they were dead throughout the Secret Wars series. Then, a few years after Secret Wars, in the new Marvel Universe that was created there, he was killed during the event Civil War II. And he remained in this sort of coma state of death for just under 1.5 years, where Iron Man was written out in the comics, and they brought in a replacement character, Riri Williams, to star in the Iron Man line in his stead. So largely, Iron Man, he's sort of died a couple of times. Only one point has it actually been a real death. That was when he was killed by his younger self, but then that was undone when he was resurrected and merged with this alternative universe of him. So if you're reading Iron Man today, you don't need to know any of this. But it does feel intrusive. It feels like if you want to know a character, that something as eventful as them dying should have some impact on their story going forwards, but quite often in comic books they just wipe that to one side. Captain America's an interesting one. So he arrived, well, he was around before, but he came back after. He wasn't there at the start of the 1960s. He was brought back out of suspended animation in the famous Captain America brought back soldier from World War II, brought back to the modern day, and he was introduced to the Avengers lineup in the early 1960s, but after the Avengers had already formed. And Captain America was a pretty solid hero all the way up to just after the first Civil War event, where he was shot, and the death of Captain America lasted for 2.5 years before he was brought back, because of course the Avengers need a Captain America. Then Captain America hung around for several years, like Tony Stark, had that brief death just before Secret Wars, and then he's been around ever since, with a few multiverse shenanigans affecting who he is at times, but there's been a constant Captain America presence in Marvel Comics. I'm not going to do the 4, because Marvel Comics' third main hero, 4, they have entered this cycle of they've built death and resurrection into his universe. They've brought in the concept of Ragnarok, where essentially the Viking gods are regularly killed and resurrected, and it's part of the cycle of the universe. So I won't do 4, but I will do a slightly more interesting, some of the notable points about Hulk. So Hulk is almost famous, just as famous as 4, for being indestructible. And in his very early comics, there was one issue very early on where he was shot by soldiers, and the issue ended with him apparently dead, Bruce Banner's body, limp, and they were declaring him fit for the mortuary. But then the very next issue, Green Giant, the Green Man, steps up, pulls finger and says, why have they covered Hulk in tarpaulins? Because, of course, they were taking him to the morgue. But this established very early on, the Hulk will always come back. Kill Bruce Banner, fine. The Hulk will come back. And yes, there have been events that appeared as though Bruce Banner have been dead over the following 40, 50 years. But there was no point where Hulk actually definitively died until the Civil War II event, where Hulk was shot by Hawkeye with a special Hulk-killing arrow that was dosed with anti-gamma radiation. It was designed to permanently kill Hulk. However, he did not stay dead very long. There were several temporary resurrections where people had stolen the body and brought him back, and then he was killed again. and then the body was stolen by someone else who brought him back, and then he was killed again. And eventually Bruce Banner settled into this sense of, oh, I'm going to continually die and resurrect. Clearly death is not for me. And he seems to be back now as this permanently resurrecting phoenix-like figure, where it doesn't really matter what you do, the Hulk's going to come back. So that really is a comic book character who's taken the concept of death and just, it won't stick. 1.5 years, and that's 1.5 years between the initial death and the final return, with several temporary resurrections in that period. And it makes you ask the point, what was the point in killing him off? I mean, there was a point in killing him off, but it hasn't stuck. It hasn't had any impact in the long run. Just as Iron Man's death in the Civil War II event has had no impact in the long run. Captain America died at the end or just after the original Civil War, and that stuck for 2.5 years. So between the mid-2000s and then the late 2010s, we've got this evidence that writing characters out of comics, saying they're dead, it's sticking for less and less time. Because if you really want to look at the famous Marvel character who died and stayed dead, it's Bucky Barnes. He was around until the early 1960s, and then he was killed off pretty much shortly before Captain America was brought out of suspended animation. Bucky Barnes was always Captain America's number 2 guy, and I think there was a sense that it wouldn't, him coming back wouldn't work with the old Bucky Barnes around. In fact, talking to comic book pros and historians and aficionados, there used to be a sense, if you go back to the millennium, there was a sense there were only 2 characters in comics who you couldn't bring back. One of them is Spider-Man's uncle, because the entire concept of Spider-Man as a storyline is about the fact he let down and his uncle died, and that's what gives Spider-Man this sense of guilt and purpose. And Bucky Barnes, because he was the equivalent for Captain America. But then, around 2004, 40 years after he'd been killed and written out of the comics, Marvel did it. They brought Bucky Barnes back. They actually had been teasing this Winter Soldier character for a while. They said he's a new villain on the scene. He's got a history. You don't know what it is, but it will shock you. And when they said, no, actually, the Winter Soldier is Bucky Barnes, 40 years of history undone. But this was actually really well adopted by the fans. They thought this was a smart and a really intelligent way of doing it. He lasted for several years, and then late 2000s, he died again, or at least appeared to die. It lasted less than 6 months. He was only written out of the comics for less than 6 months, and then they just said, oh no, he faked his death. It wasn't him who died, it was someone else, a decoy. Not the same impact as that initial death. That 40 years meant something. Hank Pym, another early Avenger, pretty much there at the start, he never really died until recently. He's currently dead. But Hank Pym is quite famous because of the very solid but rocky relationship he's had with the woman of his life, Janet Van Dyne the Wasp, who has had several important deaths to note. The first of them is that she was killed in the original Secret Wars event. This was an event that was undone at the end of the event. Then the same several years later, she was among the lists of the dead after Thanos had his famous snap in the Infinity Gauntlet event. Again, after Thanos was defeated, the snap was undone. The Wasp is back to life. She did die several years later in the late 2000s. She was killed, and killed in a beam of an energy blast that Thor was essentially unable to save her from. And she stayed dead for just under 4 years before someone decided that they needed her back. And this resurrection wasn't a resurrection. They just turned around and said, oh no, she never died in that energy blast. She was just transported to somewhere else, and she's been alive this entire time, just you haven't seen her. Just under 4 years in the late 2000s, the Wasp was written out. The last Avengers character I'd like to pull out and focus on is, well, it's not Scarlet Witch, but Scarlet Witch is relevant here. It's Scarlet Witch and her kids. Wanda Maximoff was introduced in the X-Men and the Avengers line in the early 1960s. She was initially considered to be the daughter. Twin, her and her brother Pietro Maximoff were twins. They were the children of Magneto initially, and were for a very long time. And then eventually they turned against Magneto and joined the X-Men and became heroes. But then something happens that Scarlet Witch began this romance with Vision. They married, they lived together, and they had children. Thomas and William Maximoff, who were their kids. Only someone at Marvel Editorial clearly didn't like this new family dynamic. Someone clearly said, well, hang on, he's not human. He's an android. He's a part robot. He was constructed. How can he have impregnated Scarlet Witch? How can he have conceived children with Wanda Maximoff? And this is really not something you think that you'd be discussing in a comic book, which ostensibly a lot of people have this impression comic books are for children. No, comic books are for all ages, and they can tackle a range of different emotions. So Scarlet Witch and Vision, they had this romance, they had kids, and someone at Marvel Editorial decided, no, let's reveal that they weren't naturally born. Let's reveal that they were actually magical constructs created by Scarlet Witch out of her reality warping powers and desire to have children. They're not real. And so they were deconstructed and their souls eventually absorbed by Mephisto, the actual devil. And this event happened just at the beginning of the 1990s, and it followed the breakdown of Scarlet Witch and Vision's marriage. They separated and lived apart ever since. And then for many, many years, they slowly traced Scarlet Witch becoming a more erratic character. She suffered a breakup, a divorce, and then the realization that she'd never had children. It's got to be a really traumatic event. And this all led up to an event called House of M, which involved the radical reshaping of the universe. Scarlet Witch's universe-altering powers were a big part of this. And at the end of that event, Scarlet Witch declared no more mutants. Basically, this is one of the most important events in X-Men history because it's the depowering and sort of destruction of mutants. And it's not that there were no more mutants, but they went from this sort of, if you think the X-Men ethos, this idea that humanity will inevitably turn into mutant society, Scarlet Witch took 90% of the mutant population and said, no, you're not a mutant anymore, and just turned them into relative, normal humans. And even to this event, 20 years later, it's not been properly undone. This is a significant milestone in X-Men history if you care about that. Scarlet Witch suddenly becomes the most hated woman on the planet because twice, once at the beginning of House of M and then once again at the end, her powers have basically screwed the entire planet. And this was a direct result of her mental trauma and instability, tracing back to the non-existence of her children and the breakup of her marriage with Vision. Now, around the same time that this was happening, Marvel introduced two new characters, Wiccan and Speed. They were similar characters added to the new Avengers line, and they did initially meet Scarlet Witch when she was undergoing this therapy. And I really want to know if this was planned, what happened next, or just something someone thought up of, because it's a really cool connection. Scarlet Witch, having become the most hated woman in Marvel Comics, she disappeared at the end of House of M. She was eventually discovered by Hawkeye, living in a remote village in a foreign country, having essentially lost her mind. She had no memory of who she was. She had no memory of her name. She didn't know that she was a magician. She didn't know that she had any special powers. She was just living a normal life. She was just a woman. She wasn't Scarlet Witch anymore. And having found out that she wasn't, I think they decided, yeah, it's best to leave her that way because everyone hates her. And Wanda was left in this state for several years until Wiccan and Speed, for various reasons that are quite complicated, became convinced that they had a connection with Scarlet Witch. They wanted to find her. They wanted to hunt her down. And when they eventually did find her and brought her memory back, it was revealed that Wiccan and Speed are the reincarnations of Thomas and William Maximoff. They're not the same people, but the souls of Thomas and William, when they were reabsorbed by Mephisto, cycle of life and rebirth, these new characters were born, and Scarlet Witch is not literally their mother, but through the connections of souls in the cosmos, she is their mother. And there was this grand reunion, and Scarlet Witch was sort of rehabilitated and brought back by their kids. And then a few years later, very close to each other, similar times, not exactly overlapping, but in completely different events. Speed, Scarlet Witch's son, was killed, and that death lasted for half a year. He was dematerialised and then brought back. And then Scarlet Witch was killed. That lasted for half a year. And then she was brought back. Neither of those deaths stick. But the one that was interesting is the death of her children in the early 1990s, which sparked this character-defining event. The death of the children has been partially undone, but it's not been undone in terms of Thomas and Wanda Maximoff don't exist anymore. There are two entirely separate characters who believe they have the same souls as her dead children. So again, that's not bringing the same characters back, but that is, again, comic books, they don't seem to be able to leave the dead alone. They keep playing with this idea. So that's Marvel's Avengers line. What's been going over at DC, and compiling this list was a nightmare because unlike Marvel, which often fudges its continuity but has one continual ongoing story ever since the 1960s, DC keeps having these big events where they reset things. Like Superman, if you go to a comic books and you read a Superman comic today, it is definitively not the same Superman that the people who went to a comic book shop and read a Superman comics in the 1980s were reading. They are literally separate characters. Not that the average layman would know this. So how many times has Superman died? Well, twice that I can pull out and say are significant. Only one of them even attempted to stick, and it was a big event. The death of Superman was an event. He was killed by the super powerful character Doomsday, and DC milked this for everything it was worth. There was ceremonies, there was news articles. No, the general news picked this up and they said, it's the end of an era, Superman is no more. And then only just over half a year later, Superman was brought back, because how can DC Comics exist without Superman? This big event that was publicised in general newspapers, well outside comic books. Everyone says, do you remember when Superman died? And it didn't even last a year. That lasted a similar amount of time to the first significant death of Batman. Now, this is different because they didn't actually show Batman being killed and write him out the comics the first time they did it. In the late 1970s, there was an event called, essentially around Batman's funeral, where it was his funeral and several different villains were taking their chance to gloat about how they were behind his death. And eventually it turned out it was the Joker who did it, only he didn't do it because Batman wasn't ever really dead. But this one event began with the idea of the villains gathering at the Batman's funeral and ended with the revelation, oh, he's actually tricking them all. So it's not really a death, but he was written out the comics for that period. Then, in the late 2000s, there was an event called Final Crisis where essentially a biggest bad guy in all of DC shot Batman with a bullet at the end of Final Crisis, and he was replaced by Dick Grayson, who took up the mantle of Batman, and Batman was written out for just under 2 years before it was eventually revealed he wasn't killed, he was sent back in time, and he was slowly advancing forwards in times before he rejoined the present day. Slightly interesting way of redoing that. But yeah, there was a solid just under 2 year run where Batman wasn't Bruce Wayne anymore. He was dead as far as anyone was concerned. Wonder Woman, the third most famous character, the famous heroine, leading woman of DC, her first death was in the early 1990s where she was killed by Cersei. Then her soul was restored just a few issues later. And then less than 10 years later, she was killed by Neron. And then a few issues later, it was revealed she wasn't dead. Wonder Woman has never really had a death that the publisher has even tried to make stick. But if you look at DC Comics, the most famous characters for being dead is the second Robin, Batman's number 2, Jason Todd. He was brought in after the original Robin, Dick Grayson, turned into Nightwing because Batman needed a Robin. Kept for several years before DC ran a poll where they were beginning to suspect that the audience didn't love this character and they wanted to test it. They actually said and ran a challenge, we'll do a popular vote. We could kill Robin, but we will only do it if you tell us you want us to do it. And I think I don't think DC really thought that they would get the answer, kill him. I think they were pulling a bluff here, saying, go on, if you don't like him, put your money where your mouth's with. But the audience, they wrote in, they said, no, we want this character dead. And DC, to their credit, they followed through. They had the Joker beat the second Robin to death with a crowbar. And then this became an important moment for Batman, because it showed him that actually he brings these companions, these sidekicks into battle with him. They can get hurt. They can die. And that stuck for 16 years, just under 16 years, a character called the Red Hood. Now, there have been several Red Hoods. The Red Hood was a very early villain in Batman lore, but just around 16 years later, after the death of Jason Todd, a new Red Hood appeared, who seemed to be quite significant, and it was revealed that they were Jason Todd's. They had somehow not died / well, they'd been brought back for a while, but not known who they were, and their arc suddenly became, this is Batman, because Jason Todd was trained by Batman. They are essentially were brought up to be his successor. But now the guy's died, he's been killed by a villain. He's got no mercy. Batman's code about not killing who he's fighting, Jason Todd is that, but with the shackles removed, because he's been killed. He knows what the scum are like, and he's going to go after them. And the character just hasn't evolved since this return in the mid 2000s. He's still with us. Slightly more interesting is one of the original Flashes. I can't even say the original Flash. The character of the Flash is incredibly complicated, but from the early 1960s up to the late 1980s, the main Flash people cared about was a character called Barry Allen. And the original Barry Allen died at the end of Infinite Crisis. And then it would be a full 15 years later. Essentially, he died trying to outrace the Speed Force, and it was eventually caught up with him, and you saw his sort of face and skull decomposing. He was dead for 22 years. It was 15 years. After 15 years after his death, he had a canonical cameo where he was temporarily brought back, but only for a few issues, and then dead again. And it wasn't even dead again, it was the same original death. This was just a temporary resurrection. There was then a second temporary resurrection. So he was canonically dead for 22 years, 15 of them without any hints that he could come back at all. And then from the mid-2000s, Barry Allen's been back. There have been, as I said, several versions of him due to the warping and rewriting of DC Comics history, canonicity. But, there's been 22 years where Barry Allen was dead, where he wasn't the Flash, and then DC brought him back. That is some serious sticking power to have a character dead. But the Flash brand is a bit interesting, because if the Flash dies, they'll just get a different Flash. There are loads of different Flash speedsters. But really, the franchise, and I've got to go back to Marvel for this, but the franchise where death has just become a bit of a joke is the X-Men. And it's largely that several X-Men have died. Professor X himself has said, for the X-Men, death, heaven isn't so much permanent as a revolving door. And we can see that with a few noticeable examples. But the character that really takes the biscuit is Jean Grey. Now, Jean Grey was one of the original X-Men. She was part of the original 5. And so she was around from the 1960s, and her first death canonically came in 1975. This was, I'm pulling it because this is significant, it was a case of she died one issue and came back the one after. But I'm saying this is significant because her first death was due to radiation poisoning. It was an outer space adventure. And the reason she survived is because this is when she encountered the outer space force known as the Phoenix Force, which bonded with her. So when she came back, she wasn't the same Jean Grey she'd always been. She actually renamed herself. She said, I am resurrected. I am the Phoenix. And the Phoenix hung around for several years before, in a fairly famous and twice depicted in movies comic event, the Phoenix was killed and Jean Grey died with it because it turned evil. Essentially, Jean Grey wasn't going to die, but they'd reached a point where the character had literally destroyed civilizations. And there was an edict from Marvel Editorial: you cannot let a character who is a mass murderer have a happy ever after ending. She stays dead. And Jean Grey and the Phoenix remained dead for a full 5 years before she was brought back. She remained a character of the X-Men for several years. Over that period, however, Cyclops, who had been in a relationship with her, encountered this woman called Madeline Pryor, who looked exactly like Jean Grey. Now, initially, a lot of people thought, well, Cyclops guy clearly has a type. He likes red-headed women. But it became apparent that actually, this was actually an attempt to write Cyclops out of the X-Men. He stopped being a leading character. He sort of said, I'm going to retire, and I love this new woman who happens to be just like Jean Grey. Now, I've only just met this woman, but I love her because she reminds me of this other woman I used to love. But don't talk about her. Forget about Jean. I love Madeline. But it was eventually revealed Jean came back from the dead. Cyclops was brought back into the X-Men because he abandoned Madeline and went back to his original love. And it became apparent that Madeline wasn't actually her own woman. She was a clone of the original Jean Grey who had been created because Mr. Sinister believed that a offspring, a child, between Cyclops and Jean would be an extremely powerful mutant, and he wanted them to breed and reproduce. Essentially, it was genetic manipulation via the old-fashioned traditional route of just putting a breeding pair together and seeing what offspring would arrive. Jean was dead, so clone her, and this clone can breed on Jean's behalf. Of course, Cyclops abandons Madeline Pryor. She goes a little bit mental. There's a temporary death that doesn't stick. Before she actually sort of turns evil, she's now extremely angry and jilted, and she gets killed off again. And this death was a 6-year gap before Madeline Pryor was brought back. The death stuck. She was resurrected. It was a full soul sort of ceremony resurrection. In that period, Jean Grey died twice. Once of them is the Thanos snap in the Infinity Gauntlet. Now that event was undone. But in the same year as the Thanos snap, she was killed by a Sentinel, one of the giant robots that hunts down X-Men. Now, she escaped that death it was revealed, before she died, she transferred her body over to the mind of another mutant, in this case Emma Frost. Her body was then confirmed dead. However, the possessed Emma Frost, once this danger was over, Jean transferred her mind back into her old body, now that the Sentinel was no longer trying. The weird thing is it had killed her, but by transferring her mind back into the dead body, she resurrected herself. So, again, these deaths didn't stick, but she's now at 4 canonical deaths. She then was killed by Wolverine. That death stuck only 1 issue, but it was immediately followed by her being killed by Magneto in a big finale of an event series at the end of Grant Morrison's run. Now, she was killed, that stuck a while, and then she came back in an event called Phoenix Endsong, and this revealed that the Phoenix was still around. It was still causing a load of issues, and they had to deal with the fact that Jean Grey, it had become a cliche at this point. Jean Grey dies, Phoenix brings her back. Jean Grey dies, Phoenix brings her back. So at the end of this event, they had this idea of, what if she, rather than dies, what if she transcends? What if she enters this heavenly place called the White Room? Her and the Phoenix together. That's not death. That can't be resurrected. She chose to transcend. And so this stuck for 4 years before they couldn't help themselves. They had a cameo where the transcended Jean Grey returned to our reality and then left again. It was just a cameo. 4 years it stuck. Then there was a couple of more years, and then another cameo. And then another couple of years, another cameo. Another couple of years, another cameo. Another couple of years, another cameo. And in that period, Madeline Pryor, her clone, died permanently for the 3rd time and remained dead for 4.5 years before the clone of Jean Grey, Madeline Pryor, was brought back again. And then in this gap, again, there is no Jean Grey in Marvel Comics, but several of the early X-Men, the X-Men brand was not doing well. It had really branched out and really changed a lot over this period. And someone said, well, what we need to do is bring the original team back, the original X-Men that were back in the day. And so they did exactly that. They actually had this idea of Beast time traveling and kidnapping and bringing forwards in time the original X-Men as their teenagers themselves. So young Jean Grey appears, along with a lot of the other team of young X-Men. And they go on these adventures. They actually pretty much replace the ongoing X-Men brand for a couple of years. And this young Jean Grey, she died. So even young Jean Grey can't escape being killed a couple of issues and being brought back. And then she went back in time to, fit back in where she should have in the original timeline. Because now, Jean Grey had been brought back properly. This wasn't a cameo. This was her properly returning to Earth. And she lasted a couple of years. There are 2 remaining deaths to pull out, but actually these are not significant. She was killed at the very beginning, or halfway through Jonathan Hickman's run of taking over the X-Men franchise. Several of the X-Men, including Wolverine, including Jean Grey, including Cyclops, they died on this kamikaze mission to destroy a base orbiting the sun. So they either died in the darkness of space approaching that base, or were burnt up in the sun when essentially the damage went down. But they were immediately, the following issue, resurrected. But this was how Jonathan Hickman set about this sort of resurrection protocol, where mutants, he basically said, this is getting ridiculous. Let's just say mutants can't die. They have protocols in place that whenever someone dies, they back them up, they resurrect the soul, they bring them back. So Jean Grey died in the original Powers of X-Men, and then just a few issues later, in the first couple of Wolverine issues, she was seen dead again, and presumably off-screen brought back. We haven't seen her die again since then, but presumably if she did, she'd be brought back. The person who's not going to be brought back is Madeline Pryor, who has been killed in the new... Since Krakoa was founded, she was hunted down, and she was extremely miffed and not being invited to join other mutants on the island of Krakoa, plotted against them. She was killed, and the Quiet Council decided, she's just a clone, she's not a real woman. We've got Jean Grey, we don't need Madeline, we're not bringing Madeline back. And I don't know if that's going to stick, because it's actually become a bit of a sticking point for another character who wasn't evil and loved Madeline Pryor and is extremely miffed that she's permanently dead when no other mutant is permanently dead at this point. Cyclops, the jilted lover who abandoned Madeline to be back with Jean, he had a pretty consistent run. No permanent deaths, no attempt by Marvel to write him out the comics by killing him, until in this period when young Jean was around, they had Cyclops essentially turn evil and then get killed. And he was written out of comics for about 2.5 years before he came back. Died again in the same event that Jean did at the start of Powers of X, but now he's part of this continuous circle of can't die on Krakoa. So that's the jilted partnership, and Jean Grey, it just became a cliche at this point. But she's not the only one. Professor X, the guy who founded the X-Men, he was killed off pretty early into the X-Men run. I think they had this idea that as he's the founding father, as he's the protege, he's assembled the team. He's not needed anymore. If he dies, they can flourish without it. So he was killed off, and then about just under 2 years later, they had a retcon where they said, oh no, it wasn't him who died, it was an imposter. And so they undid that death. He had a second death over a decade later. That was a deliberate death. They had plans, they already stated very clearly, we have a new body for him to move into when this death happens. But I'm showing it because it's sort of significant for the X-Men at this point. They're establishing, even back in the the early 80s, this idea of death for the X-Men isn't something to be afraid of. It's not going to be permanent if you have the right preparations in place. Then we get to the mid-90s. Professor X properly killed and stayed dead for 12 years before he was brought back. Brought back, killed again, and brought back again, and that resurrection stuck. Before he was killed again, stayed dead for 5 years, and brought back. And then he didn't die in Powers of X, but he was killed very early on into the Dawn of X Krakoa cycle, and again, it was part of the plot point that he was killed and almost within days brought back. It actually became the race not is Professor X dead, but how quickly can we bring him back? He's needed. So rather than his death becoming an attempt to be the finale of the story, it becomes a point of tension of, how long will they stay out of action? Because we actually have something that we need them to do at this point in time. 2 other X-Men to pull up who I think are significant. Nightcrawler and Wolverine. These were not early additions to the X-Men. They were added several years later in the 1970s. And both of them were pretty resilient characters until the mid and late 2000s. Nightcrawler was killed. They canonically showed that he went to heaven. He was a holy man. He has got faith. He's got religion. He's a very ethical person. Nightcrawler got his karma. His karma capable. He got his just results. He ascended to heaven. And that stuck for 4 years before he was brought back. And then they killed him again. And then they brought him back again. And then he again died alongside Wolverine and Cyclops and Jean Grey on the kamikaze mission that established Krakoa as a resurrection nation. Wolverine, now you'd assume the whole point of Wolverine is that he can't die. He's got this magical healing factor. He can't die. He keeps coming back. But early 2010s, they had this event called the Death of Wolverine. Over several years, they've established that he was losing his healing factor. And in the end, they coated him in this adamantium tomb. So not only was he stabbed and killed, he was then sealed in adamantium so that no one could get him back. Only they did. It took them 4 years, just under 4 years, to permanently bring him back. But there were several story arcs about people trying to bring him back over that period. But they just couldn't. They had someone else pick up the Wolverine title over that period. And that person, to be fair, has kept the Wolverine title. There are now canonically 2, maybe even more Wolverines running around. But the original Logan was dead for 4 years before he came back. Has been killed on Krakoa, but he's around pretty permanently now. So, is death in comics really something to take seriously? Well, the most significant death in this list would be Bucky Barnes. We've got 40 years of canonical death there. We've got 15 years for the death of Wanda's children, and that's 15 years where their fallout led to significant story arcs and changes for the plot of the characters. And even in the way it was resurrected, it had an emotional digesting and on the characters moving forward in the way that's been dealt with. In DC, Jason Todd just under 16 years, and Barry Allen just under 22. And Barry Allen just under 22 years of those characters dying. It seems to be a death of a leading character in comic books doesn't seem to stick. But these side characters around them, it clearly can. But the fall to break that is X-Men. If you're a mutant, clearly, I completely get what Jonathan Hickman was doing when he said he's fed up of death in comics for the X-Men being a serious thing, because it really isn't at this point.